The house was quiet now, too quiet. Catherine sat in her sunroom, fingers wrapped tightly around a porcelain teacup. Though the tea had long gone cold, the early evening light poured in through the tall windows, painting long shadows across the cream-colored rug. Outside, the garden she once spent hours tending looked perfectly manicured, but somehow lifeless, just like everything else in her life. Her son Henry had always filled this house with life. From the moment he was born, he became her world. She had built a life for him with pieces of her broken heart, never once complaining when the man who fathered him vanished into silence. She'd worked herself to the bone to build her company, made sure Henry had everything he needed, and more. She had given him love, not just any love, but the kind that holds you up when everything else collapses, the kind that sacrifices. And now he was slipping away. Not because of business or travel or the natural drifting of time. No, it was her, the woman, the one with the kind smile and thoughtful eyes, the one who made her son's face light up in a way Catherine had never seen before. Sandra. Catherine had known women would come. She had even welcomed them at times, young, beautiful, fleeting things that Henry entertained for a season or two. But none of them were Sandra. None of them had left him looking at the future like it was something he couldn't wait to hold. That scared her, not because she hated Sandra, not because Sandra had done anything wrong, but because this time it was different, real, permanent. And Catherine had never learned how to share the only piece of her life that had never abandoned her. She stood, setting her cup down with trembling fingers, and walked toward the grand piano that sat in the living room. Henry used to play here after school, tiny fingers struggling through. Chopin and Beethoven. She had sat beside him every evening, humming along when he got frustrated. He hadn't touched the piano in years, but it still sat there like a monument to their bond. She ran her fingers across the smooth keys, not pressing them down, just feeling their weight. Her mind drifted to earlier that week, when Henry had brought Sandra home for dinner. Sandra had come bearing flowers, white lilies, Catherine's favorite. She had smiled, polite and warm, complimented the house, asked about the paintings, even offered to help in the kitchen. And Catherine, in return, had offered her the coldest version of herself. She hadn't meant to, not really, but something inside her recoiled each time Sandra smiled at Henry, each time he looked at her like she was the answer to a question Catherine had once been. It wasn't jealousy. It was fear. Deep, gnawing fear. She had been abandoned once, left to pick up the pieces of her life, without explanation or closure. That kind of pain doesn't just fade. It imprints itself on your bones. For years she had survived by pouring everything into her son. He had been her anchor, her reason. If he left now, if Sandra became the center of his world, what would be left of hers? She heard the front door creak open. "Mom?" Henry's voice, warm and familiar, echoed through the entryway. "In here," she called, quickly smoothing her dress and brushing her hair back. He walked in, tall and handsome, his face flushed from the late summer heat. His navy blue shirt clung to his chest, and his dark curls were messier than usual. "Stopped by to drop off the groceries you asked for," he said, setting the bag on the counter. She smiled. "You didn't have to do that, sweetheart." "I don't mind," he glanced around. "You eat anything today?" "I had tea," she replied, trying to sound cheerful. He gave her a look, the one that said, "Don't lie to me." "Mom, I'll make you something." "You don't have to." "I want to." He opened the fridge, pulling out ingredients with practiced ease. She sat back down, watching him. It was easy to pretend everything was fine in moments like this. Easy to believe that nothing had changed. But it had. "You're seeing her again tonight, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Henry paused, then nodded. "Yeah, we're going to that little Italian place on Westbourne." Catherine forced a smile. "She's quite fond of pasta, isn't she?" "She's fond of good company," he said without looking at her. The silence between them stretched like wire. "She seems nice," Catherine added, her voice tight. "Charming, very forward." Henry looked up. "You don't like her, do you?" Catherine blinked. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." He turned off the stove and faced her fully, arms crossed over his chest. "You've always been polite to the women I've dated. Why is Sandra different?" She met his eyes and felt her heart falter. "Because you're different." He looked confused. With the others, it was clear they were temporary. With Sandra, You look at her like she's the rest of your life." Her voice trembled, "and that terrifies me." Henry softened. "Mom, no," she interrupted, standing. "Let me say this," he nodded. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm not trying to ruin your happiness. But you are all I have, Henry. I built this life around you. Every corner of this house, every decision I've made, it's always been for you. And if you leave, if she becomes your everything, what do I become?" He walked toward her slowly, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You don't become less, Mom. You're my mother. That will never change." "But it will," she whispered. "Not because you want it to, but because that's how love works. It changes the axis. And I don't know how to survive that again. I barely survived it the first time." Henry pulled her into a hug, and for a moment, she let herself be held like she used to hold him. "I don't want to choose," he said softly, "between you and Sandra. I shouldn't have to." "You won't," she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "But I need time. I need to figure out how to stop clinging before I push you away." He kissed the top of her head. "Take all the time you need." She pulled back and looked up at him, eyes glistening. "Just promise me, you won't forget where you came from." He smiled. "How could I?" "You're my beginning." As he left that evening to meet Sandra, Catherine stood by the window and watched. His car disappeared down the winding drive. Her heart ached in ways she couldn't explain, not because she hated Sandra, but because she had to learn how to share her heart without losing it. Henry stared at his phone screen, torn between calling Sandra or texting his mother to check if she had taken her medication. He was parked just a few blocks away from Sandra's apartment, the flowers he'd picked up earlier beginning to wilt in the passenger seat. He ran a hand through his curls and exhaled slowly. How had his life, once so defined, so clear, become a tug-of-war between two hearts? He loved his mother. Of course he did. Catherine had raised him with a quiet strength that kept their world together when it could have easily collapsed. She had never remarried, never once complained. She made every sacrifice look like a choice, even when he knew it cost her everything. And now, for the first time in his life, he was watching her unravel. Not from illness or age, but from something deeper, fear. Fear of being forgotten. And then there was Sandra. He smiled softly, just thinking about her. Sandra had this rare way of listening, not just hearing words, but feeling them. She made him feel like he was seen, not just as a provider, a son or a legacy, but as a man. Their connection had started with light flirting over coffee. But somewhere between their late-night talks and Sunday morning strolls, it had turned into something real, something grounding, something sacred. He finally put the car in gear. Sandra greeted him at the door barefoot, wearing an oversized shirt and leggings, her curls pinned up carelessly. She looked radiant, effortless. "You're late," she said, raising an eyebrow. "I know," he admitted, holding up the bouquet. "Forgive me." She took the flowers with a grin, leaned in, and kissed him softly. Always. They cooked dinner together, moving like a rhythm perfected over time. He chopped vegetables. She stirred the sauce. When the food was done, they ate on the floor of her living room, laughing at an old movie playing in the background. For a while, everything else melted away. His responsibilities, his guilt, his fears, until her hand brushed his and she asked, "Are you okay, Henry? You've been distant lately." He looked at her, seeing the concern behind her smile. "I'm trying," he said quietly, "to figure out how to be everything to everyone." "You don't have to be everything," she said gently. "Just be here with me." He reached for her hand. "It's my mom. She's struggling." Sandra nodded. "I noticed." "You have?" he asked. "I'm not blind, babe. She barely looks at me when I speak, and when she does, it feels like I've interrupted something sacred." Henry sighed. "She's not trying to be cruel, she just doesn't know how to share me." Sandra hesitated. "And you? Do you know how to share yourself?" The question sat between them like an echo. He didn't answer it, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. Later that week, Henry took his mother grocery shopping. She insisted on walking every aisle, even though her list had only 10 items. "You know," she said casually while inspecting a jar of olives, "I saw a beautiful girl at the park the other day, smartly dressed. She reminded me of that girl you dated in college. What was her name?" "Eloise." Henry bit back a sigh. "Mom, I'm with Sandra." "I'm just saying," Catherine said, smiling sweetly. That one had ambition. She worked in law, didn't she? She also cheated on her fiancé, he said sharply. Oh, they finished shopping in silence. The next evening, Sandra had planned a rooftop dinner. Lanterns, candles, music, the works. She had gone all out. Henry had barely sat down when his phone rang. Mom, he silenced it. It rang again, and again. Sandra looked up, her fork halfway to her mouth. Sorry, he murmured, answering. Hello, Henry. Catherine's voice was thin, shaky. I can't find my medication. I think I might have taken too much. Or maybe I didn't take it at all. He stood up immediately, heart racing. Are you dizzy? Do you feel faint? I'm just scared. I'll be right there. He hung up and looked at Sandra, regret written all over his face. I have to go. She nodded slowly, of course. I'm sorry, I know. He didn't kiss her goodbye. He arrived at his mother's home in under 10 minutes. She was sitting on the sofa, pale but unharmed. The pills were on the counter, untouched. She had only thought she'd forgotten them. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I panicked. He sat beside her, rubbing her back. It's okay. No, it's not. I ruined your night. He didn't answer. Was she mad? Catherine asked softly. She was hurt. A long silence followed. Do you think she'll leave? Catherine asked, her eyes glassy. I don't know, he said honestly. Catherine swallowed hard. I don't want to be the reason someone good walks away from you. Henry turned to face her. Then stop trying to make me choose. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I'm afraid, Henry, she admitted. I don't know who I am without you. You're my mother, he said firmly. And I love you. But I also love her, I know. The next morning he showed up at Sandra's door, bleary-eyed and apologetic. She let him in without a word. They sat on the couch, the air heavy. She needs you, Sandra said finally. I get that. But I need to know something, anything. Is there space in your life for both of us, or will I always come second? Henry reached for her hand. You're not second. You're my future. But I don't want to leave my past behind just to walk into it. She looked away, blinking fast. I don't want to compete with your mother. I want to love her. I've tried. I've been patient. But she doesn't want to know me. She's scared. I am too, Sandra whispered. I'm scared that no matter how much I give, I'll never be enough. He cupped her face. You're more than enough. She closed her eyes. Then prove it. He nodded. I will. That weekend they went to brunch at Catherine's house. Sandra wore a soft yellow dress and brought homemade lemon tarts. She smiled, asked questions, complimented Catherine's taste in art. Catherine was cordial, nothing more, nothing less. As they sat on the patio sipping tea, Catherine said, Sandra, do you cook often? Every weekend, Sandra replied with a smile. It's how I unwind. Interesting, I suppose that's useful. Sandra blinked. Useful? Henry stiffened. Catherine continued. Well, not every woman enjoys domestic life. I just meant it's good that you do. There it was, the subtle edge, the dismissive tone. Sandra looked at Henry, then back at Catherine. I like taking care of people I love. It makes me feel connected. Catherine's expression didn't change. How noble. Sandra excused herself soon after. Henry followed her inside, his jaw tight. I'm sorry. She doesn't want me here, Henry. She's scared. You keep saying that, Sandra said, her voice cracking. But when does her fear stop being an excuse and start being a wall? He had no answer. I want a life with you, she continued. But I can't build it with someone who won't fight for me. Henry took her hand. Then let me fight. Back outside he stood before his mother, his voice low but strong. Mom, I love you. But if you keep pushing Sandra away, you're not protecting me. You're hurting me. Catherine's eyes welled. I'm trying. Then try harder. He hesitated, then added, because one day I might have to choose. And I don't want to say this, but if it comes to that, I will. Catherine held her breath. The city sparkled beneath them, a blanket of lights against the velvet sky. Sandra leaned against the balcony railing of the hotel suite, arms folded, the breeze dancing through her curls. Henry stood behind her, his hands gently slipping around her waist. You always get quiet before something big, he murmured. She smiled without turning. Maybe I'm afraid this moment is too perfect. It isn't perfect until you believe it is, he said softly, placing a kiss on her shoulder. Tonight was theirs. No interruptions, no guilt. No ghosts of expectation lingering between them. Henry had booked the suite weeks ago. Before the tension with his mother had escalated, he almost cancelled it after the brunch incident. But Sandra deserved more than his half measures. She deserved his full presence, his heart, his courage. And tonight he intended to give her all of it. Dinner had been exquisite, fine wine, soft jazz, and a private rooftop table bathed in candlelight. But it wasn't the elegance that mattered. It was the way Sandra laughed, freely again, like a weight had been momentarily lifted. He wanted her to always feel that way. She turned to him, her eyes holding that quiet vulnerability he had come to treasure. "Henry, I need to ask you something." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Anything. When you look at our future, is she in it too?" she asked. "Your mother?" He hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the truth was layered in pain. "I want her there," he said honestly, "but I don't know if she'll let herself be." Sandra nodded. "I keep imagining us married, maybe a child someday. I picture her in the photos holding the baby, laughing with us. But then I remember how she looked at me last week, like I didn't belong, like I never would." Henry wrapped his arms tighter around her. "I see you in every version of my life, Sandra, and I will fight for you, even if it means confronting the only person who ever fought for me." A silence passed, but it wasn't heavy. It was intimate. Sandra touched his chest, her hand resting over his heart. "Then let tonight just be ours. No shadows." And so it was. They moved through the suite like a gentle storm, kissing in the soft glow of golden lamps, whispering promises between touches. It wasn't rushed or consumed by lust, it was reverent, unhurried, a language spoken with fingertips and lips. When they made love, it was more than passion. It was a vow in silence. Later, tangled in the sheets, Henry brushed her cheek with the back of his fingers. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than you know." The next morning, they walked into the cafe near Henry's office hand in hand, glowing with the closeness of the night before. They weren't expecting to run into Catherine there, but life rarely offers warnings. Catherine sat near the window, sipping espresso with an old friend. She spotted them instantly. Her smile froze in place, her back straightened, and the warmth in her eyes dimmed like a switch had been flipped. "Henry," she said with polite restraint. "Sandra. Morning." "Mom," Henry said with forced cheer. Sandra smiled warmly. "Good to see you, Catherine." Catherine's eyes swept over Sandra's disheveled curls, her soft dress, and Henry's hand still resting protectively at the small of her back. "Out late?" Catherine asked lightly, her gaze sharp. Henry replied without flinching. "We had dinner." "Stayed downtown," Sandra added. "It was lovely." Catherine's friend excused herself politely, sensing the tension. Henry reached for the coffee counter. "Let's order—" "Actually, Henry, may I have a word with you?" Catherine said, already rising. Sandra looked at him. He gave her a brief nod and followed his mother outside. Catherine stood near the flower boxes, arms crossed. "You spent the night with her," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did," he replied. "We needed time together. She's taking up so much of you," Catherine said, her voice low. "I barely see you anymore. You see me, Mom, just not alone anymore." "That's different." She turned to face him, her voice trembling. "She's pulling you away from me." "No," he said calmly. "You're pushing yourself away." "You're my son," she said, her voice cracking. "You were supposed to be my home, and now I feel like a stranger in yours." Henry sighed. "Loving Sandra doesn't mean I've stopped loving you. But it's not the same." "No, it's not," he admitted. "Because she's my partner, Mum, the one I want to build a life with. You're my mother, the one who gave me life. The love is different, but it's not less." She looked away. "I don't know how to let go." He reached for her hand. "You don't have to let go of me. Just make space beside you for her." Catherine didn't reply. Her silence said everything. When he returned to Sandra inside the cafe, her eyes searched his. "You okay?" "Not really," he said. "But I'm sure of you." Sandra smiled, brushing his knuckles with hers. "Then I'm right here." Later that week, Sandra made a bold decision. She visited Catherine's home alone. Henry wasn't with her. This wasn't about him. This was about two women who loved the same man differently and needed to find a way to coexist. Catherine opened the door, surprised. "Sandra?" I thought we should talk, Sandra said, holding a small bag. I brought you tea, the kind Henry said you like. Catherine stepped aside, unsure. They sat in the sunroom, the same one Catherine had spent hours alone in before Sandra entered their lives. Sandra poured the tea, her hands steady. I didn't come here to win you over. I came because I know I've hurt you without meaning to. And I know you've hurt me. Catherine folded her hands in her lap. You've taken my son. Sandra shook her head gently. No, Catherine, I've loved him. And I want to love you too if you'll let me. Catherine's mask cracked slightly. You don't know what it feels like to be left behind. Sandra's voice softened. You're right, I don't. I lost my mother to cancer when I was 11. But I still remember the sound of her laugh, the feel of her hands. I remember the way she looked at me when she said goodbye. And since then I've known the sting of emptiness. I just filled it differently. Catherine blinked back tears. I'm not here to replace anyone in Henry's life, Sandra continued. I just want to stand beside him, and maybe in time beside you too. There was a long silence. Catherine stared at the teacup in her hands. I don't trust many people, she finally said, but I see now. You're not trying to steal him. You're trying to love him. Sandra nodded. That's all I've ever wanted. Still, when Sandra left, Catherine didn't offer an apology. She didn't say thank you, but her eyes were no longer cold. She was listening. Later that night, Henry came home to find Sandra quiet in bed, her arms folded beneath her head. How was it? He asked, sliding beside her. She turned to face him, hard, honest, maybe a beginning. He kissed her gently. You're incredible. I'm just trying. That's what makes you incredible. He held her as the city hummed softly beyond the window, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. But 2 days later, everything unraveled. Sandra stopped by Catherine's to drop off a scarf she had forgotten at the cafe. She hoped it would be a simple, neutral gesture. Instead, it became a confrontation. Catherine was alone in the house. She opened the door, saw Sandra, and sighed. What now? I just came to return your scarf, Sandra said quietly. You didn't have to. I wanted to. There was an awkward pause. Catherine stepped aside but didn't invite her in. I know you're trying, she said. But I'm tired, Sandra. Tired of pretending I'm okay while I watch my son disappear into someone else's world. Sandra swallowed. I'm not the enemy, Catherine. You don't have to be the enemy to be the threat. Sandra stepped back, eyes glistening. Then maybe I should stop trying. She turned and left. Henry came home to find Sandra packing. No, he said immediately, panicking. What are you doing? She'll never accept me. Henry. And I can't keep begging for a place in someone else's story. Henry grabbed her hands. You are not leaving. She doesn't want me. I want you. Then choose. His heart stopped. You said you didn't want to choose, Sandra whispered. But I need to know you will, if it comes to that. Henry's voice broke. Mother, you will not lose me. But if I fail to have the love of my life, then you've already lost me. The apartment was emptier than usual. Henry sat on the edge of the bed, a suitcase still zipped at his feet. The smell of Sandra's perfume lingered faintly in the sheets, in the air like a ghost of what once was. Her side of the dresser was bare. Her books, her hair products, the quirky little frog mug she used every morning, all gone. She hadn't slammed the door when she left. She hadn't yelled. She simply kissed him on the cheek, whispered she couldn't keep walking where there was no welcome, and walked out. Now the silence hurt more than any fight could have. Henry closed his eyes, leaning forward, hands clasped together as if in prayer. But he wasn't praying. He was drowning, torn between the love of a woman who had held his world together for decades and the love of a woman who had made him want to build a world of his own. And now he was alone in both. The next day, he found himself standing in the rain outside the cemetery, the polished headstone gleaming despite the drizzle. His father's name etched in cold stone, Michael. Dane Winters died September 5th, 1997. He didn't come here often. The last time had been during college, after a painful breakup, and even then, it was more out of obligation than grief. But now, as he stood over the grave of the man who abandoned his mother, and by extension, him, he felt something shift. He used to hate him for what he did, for leaving her, for leaving them. And now he saw his face every time. He looked in the mirror and wondered if he was becoming him. He crouched down, tears mixing with rain. She loved him. She waited for him. And when he left, she gave all that love to Henry. And now she was terrified he'd do the same thing to her. He placed a hand on the stone. But he wasn't him. When he rose to leave, the clouds began to part, sunlight breaking through like mercy. Back at Catherine's house, the garden bloomed with August roses, their petals soft and full. She sat in her sunroom again, this time not with cold tea, but with a notebook on her lap. The therapist, yes, she'd finally agreed to one after her sister, intervened, had told her to journal her thoughts. What are you afraid of losing most? She stared at the question for an hour before writing just one word: everything. She hadn't heard from Henry in a week. Sandra was gone, and the quiet, once a peaceful sanctuary, now felt like a punishment. Echoes of regret crept up the staircase, lingered in the halls. She reread old letters, sifted through Henry's baby pictures, found herself crying without understanding why. And when she passed by the mirror in the hallway, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. That woman wasn't elegant. She wasn't composed. She was afraid, desperate, and guilty. The doorbell rang that afternoon. She opened it expecting a delivery, but found Sandra instead. Her eyes widened. Sandra came to return a photo in a slim black frame. It was a candid Catherine had taken of her and Henry in the garden months ago. Sandra was laughing, head thrown back, Henry's hand wrapped around her waist. She didn't feel right keeping it. Catherine stared at the photo, the image trembling in her hands, then asked if she'd like to come in. Sandra hesitated, then stepped inside. They stood in the living room, the silence taut and uncertain. Sandra wasn't there to argue. She just wanted to say goodbye properly. Catherine's throat tightened. Sandra was leaving, not for good, but giving him space to figure things out. Catherine looked at her, really looked. For the first time, she saw not a rival or a threat, but a woman hurting just like her. Catherine never hated her. She hated what she was afraid of becoming, alone again. Sandra sat down slowly. She wasn't trying to take her son away. She just wanted to love him beside her. But Catherine kept pushing her to the edges of his life. Catherine knew. She was scared. Still was. Sandra reached for her hand. It was okay to be scared. But fear shouldn't destroy what he needed most. A future. A full one. Catherine thought she already had. But Sandra told her he was still here. He just needed to know it was safe to come home, with her and with Catherine. Before Sandra left, Catherine said softly that she reminded her of the woman she used to be. Sandra smiled sadly. Then maybe there was still hope for both of them. That evening, Henry returned to his apartment, still heavy with silence. He unlocked the door, expecting the same emptiness. But he found a note on the kitchen counter. "You'll never be your father, 'cause you still show up. When you're ready to come home, so will I. S." He sat down and wept. A few days later, Catherine stood in the foyer when she heard the sound of keys turning in the lock. She froze. Henry stepped inside carrying a small plant, a potted orchid, her favorite. He thought she could use some color. She couldn't speak. She simply walked to him and wrapped her arms around him tightly. She saw Sandra. Sandra said she was leaving to give him space, but she was never really gone, was she? No. She was waiting for him to stop hiding behind guilt. And was he? He was trying. But he needed her to try too. She nodded against his shoulder. She would. They sat on the back patio that evening. Henry poured them each a glass of wine, something they hadn't done together in years. He went to see Dad, his grave. He needed to face what he'd been afraid of becoming. She didn't respond for a long time. Then she said his father left because he was weak. Henry wasn't, he stayed. Even when he was torn, he stayed. That was more than his father ever did. He didn't want to spend his life choosing between the past and the future. He wanted both. But only if they could sit at the same table. Catherine smiled through her tears. Then she'd learned to pull up a chair. Meanwhile, Sandra was walking along the shore at Brighton Beach, her hair tied up, sandals dangling in her hands. The sky was bruised with sunset, and the wind was cool against her cheeks. She hadn't spoken to Henry since leaving the note. It wasn't punishment, it was space. But as she stood watching the waves crash against the rocks, her phone buzzed. "Text from Henry, I'm ready to come home." and I want to build it with you. Can we meet at our place tomorrow at 7? Her fingers trembled as she typed, I'll be there. The next evening, Catherine found herself in the garden again. But this time she wasn't alone. Sandra arrived just after sunset, a soft scarf around her shoulders. Henry waited for them both. He wanted them to sit together. No pressure, just a new beginning. The table was simple, just tea and candles. No grandeur, no ceremony. Catherine looked at Sandra, really looked. She used to believe loving someone meant never letting go. But she was learning that sometimes love meant stepping aside so they could fly. Sandra's eyes glistened. Thank you. Henry reached for both their hands, and for the first time they sat not as opponents, but as parts of the same story. Not perfect, but possible. Catherine had not transformed overnight, but she had begun to do the work. Her therapist, a gentle but firm woman named Grace, helped her peel back years of hurt, layer by painful layer. I wasn't afraid of Sandra. Catherine had finally confessed during one of her sessions. I was afraid of becoming invisible. Grace had smiled, kind and knowing. But you aren't invisible, Catherine. You're evolving. Since that breakthrough, Catherine had tried to be more present, less guarded. She called Henry just to talk. She asked about Sandra, sometimes even by name. She didn't always know the right words, but she was trying. That had to count for something. One afternoon, Henry picked her up and drove her to a small jewelry boutique, nestled between a bookstore and a florist. He didn't say where they were going until he parked and looked at her. I'd like your help picking her wedding ring. Catherine blinked, startled. You want me to choose the ring your future wife will wear? She asked slowly. I want you to be part of this, he said gently. Not because I need your approval, but because I love you. And I want Sandra to feel like she's marrying into something whole. Something about the way he said that broke her. Inside the shop, Catherine surprised herself by gravitating toward a delicate band of rose gold with a single, pear-shaped diamond and 2 tiny sapphires on either side. Sandra has this quiet elegance, she said. This reminds me of her. Henry's smile was radiant. It's perfect. Weeks later, on a warm March afternoon, Catherine found herself seated next to Sandra in the garden behind Henry's townhouse. It was unplanned. They had both wandered out there for air, perhaps to escape the chatter of the engagement dinner preparations inside. They sat in silence at first. Birds chirped nearby. A breeze danced through the budding lavender. Catherine cleared her throat. He tells me you love lavender. Sandra nodded, smiling faintly. It reminds me of my grandmother. She used to plant it outside her kitchen window. A pause. Then Catherine asked almost shyly, You grew up with her? Mostly, Sandra replied. My mother died when I was 11. Cancer, my father. Tried, but he never recovered. Catherine looked at her, truly looked, and saw for the first time the woman behind the poised smiles and polite replies. There was strength there, yes, but also loneliness. Familiar loneliness. I'm sorry, Catherine said softly. Sandra glanced at her, unsure how to respond. Catherine continued, her voice unsteady. When I was your age, I was in love once, madly, stupidly. I thought I'd never breathe without him. Sandra listened. When he left, I told myself I'd never depend on anyone again, not even my son. But then Henry grew up, and somehow he became everything I was afraid to need. Sandra's eyes shimmered. That's not a weakness. It became one, Catherine said. When I saw how much he loved you, I panicked. Because love like that is powerful, the kind of powerful that reminds you of what you lost. Sandra's throat tightened. And I spent my whole life wishing someone would love me like that. With their whole heart. The silence between them shifted. Not heavy this time, just real. I think we're both just afraid of being left behind, Sandra whispered. Catherine nodded, her eyes damp. But I'm tired of holding on to fear. Sandra reached for her hand. Catherine didn't pull away. For the first time, the space between them didn't feel like a war. It felt like a bridge being built, stone by honest stone. The evening air was balmy as guests arrived for Henry and Sandra's engagement dinner. The backyard had been transformed with fairy lights, round tables draped in cream linen, and floating candles bobbing in shallow glass bowls. Henry held Sandra's hand tightly as they moved between guests, accepting congratulations, laughter, and the occasional emotional hug. The air smelled like jasmine and grilled rosemary chicken. When it was time for the toasts, Catherine rose from her seat. A hush settled over the guests. Henry and Sandra exchanged a brief look, half anxious, half hopeful. Catherine held her champagne glass a little too tightly, but her voice was clear. "I've never been good at letting go," she began. "When you raise a child alone, you learn to hold on tighter than most, maybe too tight. Henry has always been my world, and I thought that meant I had to keep him to myself. But watching the two of you has shown me something I didn't know I needed." She paused, looking directly at Sandra. "I see now that letting go doesn't mean losing. Sometimes it means gaining more than you ever imagined." Tears welled in Sandra's eyes. Henry's grip on her hand tightened. Catherine raised her glass. "To letting go and gaining more." The crowd applauded gently, but for Henry it was thunderous. It was the loudest piece he'd ever heard. The wedding day dawned bright and cool. The garden was a dream, rows of white chairs, ivy-wrapped arches, soft music humming through the air. A canopy of string lights waited above the dance floor for the evening to come alive. Sandra stood in her simple satin gown, nerves fluttering in her stomach. Her bouquet was a blend of lavender, white peonies, and eucalyptus. Her heart was steady yet full. Henry waited under the arch, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the woman who had taught him to be brave with his heart. Catherine stood at the end of the aisle, her arm linked with her son's. She wore a navy blue dress and a string of pearls that had once belonged to her mother. Her eyes were glassy but determined. "You sure about this?" she asked with a soft smile. Henry grinned. "I've never been more sure of anything." She took a shaky breath, then placed a kiss on his cheek. "I'm not walking you away from me," she said. "I'm walking you toward the life you deserve." He blinked back tears. Together they took those steps down the aisle, past the doubts, into something bigger than either of them could have imagined. Catherine placed Henry's hand in Sandra's and stepped back, not as an outsider, but as someone finally ready to stand beside their love. That night, as twilight descended, Sandra and Henry danced their first dance beneath a sky freckled with stars. The string lights above them glowed warm and golden. Laughter bubbled from the guests, glasses clinked, and the scent of jasmine swirled on the breeze. Catherine watched from a wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. A tear slid down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from release, healing, hope. Beside her, Grace, the therapist she had quietly invited to the wedding, smiled and handed her a napkin. "They look happy," Grace said. "They are," Catherine replied, "and so am I." She turned her eyes back to the dance floor, where Henry spun Sandra gently, both of them laughing like children. The music rose, and their love echoed through the garden like a promise. And in that moment, surrounded by wildflowers, warm lights and second chances, Catherine finally understood. The space between us isn't meant to divide. It's where love at last is allowed to grow. Thank you, my amazing vintage Mike Tales family, for taking the time to listen, feel, and journey with me through another emotional story. Your support means more than words can express. Every like, every comment, and every subscription is a reminder that storytelling still has the power to heal, connect, and inspire. To those who shed a tear, smiled quietly, or saw a piece of themselves in this story, thank you for opening your heart. This channel exists because of you. Let's keep celebrating love, resilience, and the beauty of raw emotion together. Until the next tale, stay kind, stay true, and never stop believing in love.